All right, so today, building off what Paul was talking about, my talk is going to be about two different aspects of African American heritage in the capital region and its relationship to land ownership. So, um, I'm really interested in community formation. So, how do kinship relations form? And then from there, going to neighborhoods, and then finally, communities forming. And then also, family farm ownership. So, the ownership of land. And because there were a lot of farm workers, but not too many African Americans who were able to purchase land, and the management and the inheritance of that land, which is very important to um, the generation of wealth and passing that wealth down. So I want to talk about some of those things, those two issues. Archaeology and genealogy, they share the same thing in terms of, and we heard a lot of this from Paul, in terms of understanding people. That's our subject, understanding what happened in the past, but we're interested in time. So, in archaeology, as Paul told you a little bit about, and I will be telling you probably less about that. When you dig down through the ground, you're generally the earlier artifacts are farther down, and then the later artifacts are up on the top. So we're interested in time, how things change through time, and then a space, then landscape. So what happens on a particular, say, a farm? When do they build a barn? Where do they build it? And what time period? And then how those things relate to other areas, other farms, neighbors, and so on. So it's just sort of time and space. And I like this outline. I think this is actually probably from Jim Dietz originally, this sort of arrow. So I want to talk about two areas today, and I've talked about this before. Somebody had mentioned earlier that they saw a talk I gave down in New Scotland, and there's some information here that's the same. So there's two neighborhoods here, African American neighborhoods. One's north of here in what was Watervliet and is now Colony. The second is down in South Bethlehem, what is Selkirk or Boght Corners. And so I'm going to use those two as examples of this community formation and to talk about black farmers in the region. Okay, so obviously I'm going at this as a lot of you have, I'm sure, seen census records, but if you don't know, this is a good way to understand where people are located because if you look at a census sheet, usually it'll be in the 19th century at least, it might be September 28th, and then you'll have 4 or 5 sheets that are September 28th. So the census taker's going down the road and recording. So you can use this as spatial data. If it goes from September 20th to October 20th, then he might be in a different area. But you can tell by the people around where folks are living. In this case, Lot Van Dusen is one of the founding members of the Van Dusen family in Queens, south of Bethlehem. And so you can see some of the individuals there. One of the problems that we have in a lot of cases, and anybody who's done genealogical work using the census will probably run into this. So you look 10 years later and you have Lot Wands. Um, but you see, so, if you go from 1840 to 1850, you have the other family members. In 1840, of course, you just have numbers of individuals living there. So is this the same person? So I couldn't originally I couldn't find it and then find him. And then fortunately Lot is obviously it's a biblical name, but it's an unusual name. So I found Lot Van Dusen again in 1855. Well, as it turns out, this is the same Lot as you see here in 1850. It's just a different name. And I don't know why that's the case, but that's an example. I've seen this a couple times with some of the black families that I've been looking, doing the research on here in the region. So that's one example. So then you can take this information and couple it with some of the maps. Like in this case, it's a 1854 map of Albany, and you see the names on there. Not all the names are there, of course, but you can use that along with the census data to get an idea where these places were on the land. And so I'm going to be talking about South Bethlehem first. And these two circles here are two areas where um, black families were able to purchase property. And so by purchasing that land, then you see other families move around and you see this community formation occurring. And then you can use these, of course, these maps and through time to see how things change, see where people move. And you can see here on the bottom where you've got so the Jackson family. See right here it says Jackson. I'll be talking about the Jackson. So there's Samuel Jackson and Anthony Jackson. Down here in 1866 it says Dixon. And this is because the Dixon family married into the Jackson family. And then, of course, this is 1860s census, so you can see these are all the black families that were living in that one area, Jacksons, and then here's John Dixon. So that's just some of the easy way, sort of low hanging fruit of how to find out where people were on the land. Um, so in this area, down by Boght Corners, and then just in the north in Queens, these are some of the founding families of the area, some of the founding African American families, the Pentons, the Springsteads, the Jacksons, the Thompson family, the Prince family, and so on. And these, like any rural area, the families intermarried, so you get the Pentons married in the Van Dusen family, and so on. The interesting thing here is that they're all these families are pretty close to the river, so they're within a couple miles of the river. And the reason why they're here is because most of these families were enslaved by the Dutch families in this area. So if you go through the census, like from 1790, you'll see places where maybe one sheet there won't be any enslaved people living there, and then the next sheet you'll have all these families like the Vandenbergs or the other older white families from the area, and you'll have 5 or 6 enslaved people. Uh, so this was their home. This is what they knew. They knew all the people in the area. They had kinship relations already, so they don't move too far from where they were enslaved. So you can use this to actually go back through, and if you look through the wills before emancipation, you can start seeing first names, and sometimes you can pick up maybe another generation or maybe even 2 generations back with the families. So I was able to do a little bit of that. So these are the families. These are the two areas. One of the largest enslavers in the area was Rensselaer Nichols. In fact, he was probably the largest enslaver in Albany County. And so the most famous person is Caesar Nichols, and some of you might have seen this photograph. It was on the cover of Slavery in New York, which was a catalog from an exhibit down in the Historical Society, New York Historical Society, in 2005, I believe. So he's a famous individual in the fact that we actually have a picture of Caesar. But there are all these other families, the Thompsons, the Jacksons, the Knott family, that we know individuals were enslaved there, and then they got their freedom at some point along the way. So you can see there, this is where the Nichols Sill House is. So the Jackson family, in 1827, they were able to purchase a parcel of land right at at a crossroads here, just a little ways from Becker's Corner, and from John Soap. So John and Lucretia Jackson were able to purchase this land along with two of their sons, Samuel and George. And then I want to just kind of go through how this land went from their ownership all the way down to really today. So there are family members that still own this land. And this was a 7-acre parcel of land. There were 3 houses on the property. We haven't done any archaeology here, but this is just an example of what we tried to develop as we're doing archaeology. So Samuel and Elizabeth Jackson, you can see in 1850 the number of people here. So a lot of families, once the Jacksons get this property, then a lot of other families move around and they're staying in other houses renting. So then it goes from Samuel and Elizabeth to their daughter Sarah. She marries into the Knott family. So Garrett Knott. Here again, you can see the numbers of people. The Holland and Thompson families are up here, and they're continuing on to the next generation. Then around 1900, they sell the property up there. But this property right here at the juncture of Beaver Dam Road is still owned by descendants of the Jackson family. So Grace, they have a daughter, Grace. She marries Peter Van Dusen, and then their daughter, Christine Van Dusen, and then the property transfers to her daughter, Ida Van Dusen, and then there's two more generations of family members who actually own the land today. So 200 years of land ownership in that particular area. So these are some of the genealogy sheets I used. I asked the other folks if I should put these up, and I figured maybe some people would be interested. So I like to sort of, map things out first. And so you can see here again, Ida Van Dusen, Catherine Van Dusen. If you get to Grace Knott and Peter Van Dusen, okay, here's Grace Knott. Some of the other things I mentioned, but Elizabeth Holland, so I was able to get her last name. We have church records from the Dutch Reformed Church, so that's good because you can get the maiden name if they're married in the church, and a lot of these folks were. Um, Hannah Thompson here marries Henry Knott. So you can see a lot of the family members are intermarrying, creating these kinship relations. And this line here, these are all people who are born in slavery or born enslaved. Peter Van Dusen goes all the way back to Lot Van Dusen I mentioned earlier down in Queens. So it's really this larger Queens and South Bethlehem that, in fact, South Bethlehem was for the township of Bethlehem, right at that little juncture, and then to the north where the Hollands were living. 70% of all African Americans in the entire Bethlehem township were living right there. Okay, so that's South Bethlehem. Then I want to talk about farm ownership. And for this project, we're going to look at a site north of Albany. Here's a few numbers to think about. At really the height of black ownership, farmland in this country was about 1910. They owned about 15 million acres of land. That number decreased dramatically by the early 2000s. And then also the number of black farmers decreased. And this is, you're going to see this with white farmers as well. As the farms get larger, people move off the farms and so on. But the most remarkable part about it is the land ownership, because anyone who understands about farming, farmland is very valuable in the sense that you don't have to improve it. You can get rents off of it. So if you have farmland in the family, that just continues to keep on giving, and the land value goes up. So this is a way of building generational wealth. And today there are very few African American farmers in New York. And it's hard to start out farming because you have to have very expensive equipment. And then, of course, you have to have access to the land. So this is a very different situation north of Albany than we saw down in Bethlehem. There aren't any African American farmers who own their own land down in Bethlehem. So here you have 5 farms that I was able to identify, and this is throughout the entire township of Watervliet, as it was known in the 19th century. The way that these folks got their land was in different ways. You can see here the site I'm going to be talking about, this Thomas Powell site. So you can see here's Powell, and then this is on the 1854 map again. He's right here. These numbers are referred to. I recorded all the census record from the ag census, which is great. You have, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that data, but from 1850 to 1880, every 5 years there's a ag census, and it tells what the farms were producing, how many livestock, what the farm equipment was worth, and so on. So you can really get an idea of what these farms are are doing how they're doing economically. So this is the way that a lot of these families got their land. Prince Jackson, most of the farmers on here got their land from former enslavers, except for Prince Jackson and then Michael Thompson here, who purchased his Michael Thompson purchased his 3 acres for $100 from Isaac Mark, who we heard about earlier. So his Michael Thompson's place was just one of the maps that Paul had up there. His house was just across the road from that, and it's shown on there. Um, so we know exactly where his house was. Um, a lot of the other ones you see here, Betty Thompson and Mary Jackson received the land for $1 because they were enslaved by Abraham Whitbeck, and then when they got their freedom, he granted them 4 acres. The Powells purchased outright from the Fonda family and Lansing families that had enslaved them. Same with the Thompson family. So, and then Prince Jackson is the only one that actually he got the 2 acres by working for the Shakers. So, like, I think it was a certain number of like 6 or 8 shillings a day, and once he had 68 days was enough to pay for the land. So, one of the reasons why these other families got their land was because they were part of the Dutch Reformed Church. So the Thompsons and the Jacksons, or the Thompsons and the Powells for sure. A few of the Jackson members were as well part of the church. So in talking about the Powell family, we know where Elizabeth and Thomas were enslaved. We know where they lived. Here's the widow marks. You saw this earlier. Paul showed this. So you've got Elizabeth Powell was living here. Thomas Powell's up here, and then so this house right here. This would have been Michael Thompson's house. And we know this because in later maps we have Patrick Ryan living there, and Patrick Ryan bought the property from them, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So we know that they were living here. They were enslaved there. They knew each other. They went to the Dutch Reformed Church. So this is really where that's where the story sort of starts, or as far back as we've been able to trace it. So Dow, Fonda, and Durkee Lansing, here again, all the Lansing and Fonda families. It's the same with the White families. They're intermarrying between the different, names that you see up there. And so the Whitbecks, the Fondas, the Lansings. So you see, by this time, both of the patriarchs have died, which is good because then they're leaving a lot of records, right? So by 1800, we have Hendrika and Jane Lansing. And within that household, we have Thomas and Betty. We know that that's where they were enslaved. And then two of the siblings, two of the children, Dow A. Fonda, which you saw Paul showed a picture of the tombstone of Dow A. Fonda earlier. So Dow Fonda and Durkee or Derica Lansing, they marry in 1802 in the church, and 6 years later, Thomas and Betty marry in that church as well. And they were enslaved at this time, but they were both in the same household by this time. They have their first daughter, or their only daughter, Jane, in around 1810. And then, so in 1810, the census here, you can see here's Dow A. Fonda. And then over here on the right-hand column, this is the enslaved people. These are free people here. And then these are the white family members here. So we have 3 people in this column, and that's Thomas, Betty, and Jane Powell. So by 1818, both Thomas and Betty have gained their freedom, and they purchase a property here, this 1818 green property. They purchased this 5 acres for $300, which is important at that time because by 1821, New York passed a statute where people were free to vote. White families members were free to vote if they had they were able to vote regardless of the land that they owned. But there was a stipulation in that law that African Americans had to own at least 250 acres of land. So by owning 300 acres of land, Thomas Powell would have had the right to vote. So that's important symbolically, if nothing else. And then by 1820, their son Paul is born. So also in that year, they purchased another parcel of land. So they had about 8 acres of land. So they're starting to build. So it's really one of the largest African American farms in the region by this time. So the archaeology, the site itself now, so if you go back here, it's kind of located up in this area to the northern part of the parcel. This would have been their homestead site. This is a water-filled cellar hole. There was a large cellar there. There were some other, lots of foundation stones. So we knew it probably wasn't, it's a very large building, probably wasn't all built at one time, certainly not in 1818. So we wanted to try to figure out like what some of the sequences were with the buildings, and you could do that through the dating of artifacts and what Paul was kind of going through earlier. So we took some of our friends and colleagues and went out there to do some excavations. And so we've been digging there from 2022 till just last couple weeks ago. We were out there again. And the reason why we actually went out, this is back in a wooded area. You can see it's very heavily wooded. It's been preserved, but there's an ongoing threat that the site is going to be sold and it might be developed. So we wanted to go out and really get some information and get some solid data. We could go back, especially to the town, and say, you need to acquire this property. It's very important. The archaeology is all intact and so on. So that's why we originally went out there. So we've done some limited excavations. The first thing we realized, the first place we could kind of dug over here was a 16 by 16 foot portion of the building, and we think this is actually was a standalone original house. You can see it's got a stone foundation. It would have had a wooden superstructure over top. This year we found the hearth to the structure. It's still in place, but we removed the soil on top and mapped it in. There's some earlier artifacts there. All the earliest artifacts are right in this area. So we did some other test excavations over here, and I'll kind of show you those. And we didn't find anything early, so no early 19th century stuff. So we've got a hearth. So the building was, these are some of the artifacts there. So an early Connecticut button, a thimble here, and this Chinese export porcelain. This year, just a couple weeks ago, we found, this is saucer, and we found a cup of the same kind of Chinese Canton rim porcelain. So, and it's right, it was within probably 5 feet from this vessel. So at least they had a teacup and saucer. And then you find things like this brick is really bad quality, looks like a loaf of banana bread. They probably got what they could get, you know. So they weren't spending, even though they had some fine things, they weren't spending a lot of, there's very few artifacts. They weren't really spending a lot of their money on material things. They were really saving it up for land. And that's the theory. So this is what the building would have been. You know, all this wouldn't have been here. This is kind of what the archaeology is telling us. So it might have looked something like this. This is a typical outer kitchen from the 19th century, or from the 18th and 19th century. And this is located down on Long Island. It's got the gable end chimney and a front door here, so, and about the same size. So this would have been what the original Powell house looked like. And if you think there was only 4 people in the family, so it would have been big enough. The site goes through a lot of changes in the 1840s and 1860s, and this is where genealogy really helps a lot, because you're getting information from the census record, tax records, and so on, to kind of tell you what's going on the farm and how people were, why you see the things in the ground that you see, what kind of changes were happening in the family. So we know that the Powells had a third child, John. He shows up in 1850. Betty has passed by then, so she may have died in childbirth, perhaps. John Powell only shows up in 1850. So by 1855, he vanishes. So I think he died in some way, but I don't, there's no record of it that we've been able to find. So then you go back to just Thomas, Betty, or in this case, just Thomas and his son and daughter. By 1855, the son Paul marries Anne Hannah Elizabeth Kilbourne. She was from Troy. And their first child, Thomas D. Powell, is born. Uh, Thomas and Betty's daughter, Jane, never married. So that's important too. So it's a very small family, and it's leaving a fairly small footprint in terms of the genealogy. But by 1865, you really get a big change. You see all these family members or all these people living at the site, and they're listed as two separate houses. So that kind of gave us the idea. Well, you got two different houses here, and what's going on with that? And we think we know about the archaeology, but so 1865, you get all these names. Paul and Hannah are married. Their son is here. Betty Adams is Hannah's mother. Her husband is James Reed. James Reed was born in the West Indies, but somehow along the way, he acquired some means. He had personal as well as real property. And then two individuals here that just show up in 1865 and then they vanish from the record. Arthur and James Jameson. And then, of course, Jane Powell. And then you have Thomas and Maria Powell, who's listed as his wife. And remember, Betty dies. So Thomas and Maria Powell are listed in the second household here. So what's going on? That is this a mistake? Because sometimes older people will move in, right? You'll see somebody move in and they just kind of show up, and it's usually a family member, and they'll be in their 80s and they show up in the house. This happens a couple of times, but in this case, what we found out was that Maria was Michael Thompson's wife. So Michael Thompson dies sometime before 1850, and then his widow Mary was living on that property. Thomas and Mary get married sometime between 1860 and 61, right in here. And so after they get married, they sell that 3-acre property down by the Mark house and take that money and put it back into the farm. So you actually see this a lot with the Powells. They get land. The railroad comes through. They get paid for that land, and they use that to buy additional land. They get paid here for this land, and they take that and use it to make these improvements. So you really see them capitalizing on land and building up the Powell farm. So the second house we think is right here, and we found what appears to be a second hearth. You know, we had a hearth over here, and then we have one here. It's facing the other way. So this we know was an exterior wall, like right here, because we dug down in here and it's really substantial. So it doesn't look like an interior wall at all. So we think that's the hearth, and then so here would have been the outside wall, and then this we think is an addition. So this line of stones, we think this is an addition on the back side. So you have the house wall there, and then you have this post-60s addition, and then there's a borrow pit here. So borrow pit's a word archaeologists use, other construction use it. So it's where they dug out the clay clay is obvious. This whole area is underlined with clay. So clay is a very nice material to create an impervious surface. We know that they filled all of these. We did some excavations here, and about this far down, it's solid clay, but it's displaced clay. So it has a few artifacts in it. So it's clay that they dug out, after the house had been established. They dug out some clay and they used it to fill the inside to make a nice surface to either put down a floor or maybe just have a clay floor, just a swept clay floor. So this you see all over the place. In fact, I think I'm going to talk about the cellar in a little bit. When they dug this cellar, I think they used a lot of that clay to shore up around the building, and we're finding that all around the building there's clay because it makes a nice positive drainage away from the house. But in this borrow pit, they dug this clay out, and then you got this big hole, and they filled it with artifacts. So one of the more interesting artifacts here is this spoon, and you can see it says HEK. Well, that stands for Hannah Elizabeth Kilbourne. So it was a silver spoon that Hannah owned with her maiden name on it, and it was in that borrow pit. So we know that Hannah and Paul married sometime between 1855 and 1860. So we know that the artifacts within there have to be after that time because she wasn't on the site then. So it's kind of an interesting dating tool, but it's more interesting in terms of its connection to the actual people in the house. So this is probably what it looked like. This is our guess. We're not sure, but you might have had two buildings here with one of them facing. This would be a traditional way. It's facing south, and you've got this gable end chimney. But this one would have been facing to the east, a door to the east. So you have this shared yard. I mean, this is possible. We know that there was a fence. There's very few. There's very few artifacts in this part. So we dug units along here, excavation units. So right out in here, it's hardly any artifacts, and it's their front yard, so they're keeping it clean. There's very little soil development, so maybe 2 to 3 inches because it hasn't been plowed. And all the artifacts that really are being found in the yard are later, so 1880 or later. So they're really kept keeping this yard very clean. And then on the other side of the fence, that's where you find your garbage. So you're throwing stuff over the fence. This is classic. You see this in all rural sites, including the farmstead where I grew up. And then you have this post 60s. So this is probably what it looked like. This is our guess of what it looked like at that time in the 1860s. This is another interesting sort of interlude here with, remember I mentioned James Reed. Um, well, Jane, uh, Paul, Paul and Hannah had two children, Thomas D. Powell and Jane Powell and Jane E. Powell. And then at some point, she starts going by Jane E. R. Powell. Well, that's for Reed. So her, so Hannah's, this is the will of James Reed. So Hannah, is James Reed's stepdaughter. So Jane Elizabeth Reed Powell would have been James Reed's step granddaughter. And when he dies, he leaves basically all of his property to them. And he did actually have a grandson, William, and he leaves a little bit to him as well. But most of it goes to Hannah and her daughter, Jane, Jane Powell. So you can see here he had a marble table that was in the house already. And remember, they're living over in the Powell estate at this time. And then also $360 in cash. So here again, they were able to use this money to improve the farm. All right. So this kind of gives you an idea of the value of the Powell farm. It was one of the lowest valued farm. I mean, they got really the worst land. That's how they were able to buy this land. So in 1855, you can see they're sort of toward the bottom of these comparable farms in the area. And then by 1880, the farm value has shot up. So they're one of the most valuable farms. So it's not that you remember in 1855, they had 50 acres as they do in 1880. So the land isn't getting more valuable. It's that they're improving the land. They're improving the farm. And what they're doing is they're improving it for milk production. So by sometime between 1875 and 1880, the Powell family goes all in on the milk business. So they're the largest milk producer in the area. So they're supplying the neighborhood up in northern Watervliet with milk. So they've really invested. They're investing a lot in the farm. They invest in the farm buildings here. We think maybe this is the time when they build this huge cellar, this 26-foot long cellar, and you can see it's the cellar's here, and then the building, the earlier building's there. So they kind of tied that into the other building. You can see here's a dark layer of a trench where they've used it to tie into the other structure. And so this is what we think that looks like by 1880. You know, you have the buildings, the different sequences. You have some midden areas or some areas of debris and garbage. We think we have a garden, and we can tell by the garden because it goes from in this area being really shallow, and then it gets really deep. Pretty dramatically right in here. So it looks like they probably had a kitchen garden over on this side early on. And so that's kind of what the sequence is. So as I said, by 1880, they're really ramping up the farm. They're putting a lot of money into the farm. They buy another property in 1875. So by that time, they had 43 acres, and they pay $2,500 for the other parcel that they purchased. So they're planning ahead for the future and for the family, Thomas and Jane, to really take over the farm. But then Paul dies in 1884. So this kind of throws everything, their plans, into chaos because Thomas isn't old enough to take over the farm. They move back over to Troy. They try to lend to rent the farm, which they're able to do in one case. They try to sell the farm. These records, I'm sorry, they're a little bit fuzzy, but they give some good information on the house and some of the barns and some of the improvements that they've made. But they're trying to sell it. They're trying to get out from under the debt. They sell the other property that they bought for $2,500 for $1,500, and so they're kind of downsizing at that point. In 1905, Thomas, the grandson, comes back in and tries to and does start up the milking business again, and that lasts about 10 years until he dies. So, so by 1820 or by 1920, Jane Powell is the last person living there, and so she dies in 1926. So between 1920 and 1926, you see the the Powell estate. These are tax records that you can get with the county. The Hannah Powell estate is paying the taxes, and this continues even after Jane dies. It continues. It says Hannah Powell estate, and they're paying the taxes until it's taken over by Grace Edwards. So this was really a question, like, who is Grace Edwards? And first, there were some Edwards families around, but I wasn't sure if what fit. So I tried to go down this rabbit hole and figure out what's going on with that. So I found out that Grace was a Hegeman, and she lived over in Troy, and this is her brother Charles Hegeman, and her other brother Garnett. Garnett's nice because it's an odd name, so you can sometimes trace people down with the name Garnett. So this is 1905. By 1930, they're in Detroit, Michigan. So they moved to Detroit. Grace Edwards is a police officer in Detroit in the 1930s. Her brother works. He was a mortician, and then he worked for in the auto plant because he could make more money. So they did well up in Detroit, but they moved out of the area. But they were absentee owners, so they owned the property for the next couple decades. So then I was trying to figure out, like, well, how did they get the land? Because there's no transaction with the land. In fact, there's no transaction from the time the Powells started till this point. I mean, they just kept the land. There's no wills, passing. They just passed the land down to the family members. Same thing happens with the Jackson family. There's no land records. They just passed it down to the larger family. So you have 20, 30 people who actually own the land. So what I found out was, okay, so you see Hannah Kilbourne here. This is from the Troy census in 1855. Hannah's here. Dinah Van Skyke and Betsy Adams were sisters. So that means their daughters, Hannah and Harriet Van Skyke, they were first cousins. And then Harriet marries into the Hegeman family. And so, and then you see Diana Van Skyke there. So she marries into that family. And then that's how they got that. That's how they got that property. So Jane would have been, the younger Jane would have been second cousins with Grace Edwards. And so then the story ends in the 1950s when they finally sell the property for $5,000. But this was curious when I looked at this first. I'm like, wait a minute, the person is from Michigan. How did that happen? So I was able to kind of piece that together. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how important it is to understand those different changes in family ownership, especially with African American families, and both for kinship and then also for farm ownership. It's very important. Well, thank you.